Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening to wherever you're from. Welcome to the new first inaugural second V2 episode of For the Sake of Open, where we're going to be talking about contributing to open source. My name's David. I'm a developer advocate working on OpenSearch here at AWS. And with me, I have Tuana and Omar. I'm just going to have Tuana, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes, and I really hope people can hear me now. Please let us know if you can't. But yes, I'm Tuana. Thanks, David, for having us. I am the developer advocate at Deepset, and I work mostly with our open source NLP framework, Haystack. And I'll hand over to Omar.
Hi everyone. So I'm Omar. I'm a machine learning engineer at Hugging Face. I am also the lead of developer advocacy here. And excited to be here.
Nice. So I just saw in the chat that we are coming in loud and clear, which I'm really excited about. If you guys were here last week, you know we had a ton of audio issues, which I'm just going to say OBS is really tough to get going. But regardless, we're happy you all can hear us now. And with that, let's start by talking about, what is open source? Like, what does that mean to you guys? And just open it up. Yeah.
Also, I'll start it off and then we can just chat about it. But yeah, to me, open source, I think it's probably going to be pretty much a repetition of many resources you'll find. But any piece of software code that people are freely able to use, modify, I think that's the important one, and in some respect distribute is an open source project, which is exciting because alongside contributing to the code, there's a lot more that comes with it. There's a community aspect to it that comes as well. What do you think?
Yeah, I think this community aspect is the most, at least for me, it's the most special part of open source. Many times people just open source their projects and other people either build on top of that and create new projects, or you can have hundreds of people that are not working for a single company, just contributing to the same place. So I think that's something that is very exciting about open source.
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think I lean back a little bit more on the legalistic perspective of it, because for us, our license is a big deal. Being licensed, that anyone can use it and reproduce it, modify it, use it however you like. The code is out there. We're not hiding anything. That's a really big part of what I think open source means to me and the OpenSearch community in particular, which is so cool. I mean, it's phenomenal being able to have, like you said, Omar, so many different types of people, personalities, different experiences, working on a single bit of code. I mean, that's free value for anyone, which is really neat.
Yeah, and something that I think is interesting is that open source is not just code. There are many artifacts around open source. So there is documentation, but then even if we're not talking about software projects, if we're talking about machine learning projects, you can do open source work around machine learning models. You can do open source work around data sets. So it's really a growing, I would say the scope of what open source really is growing and growing.
Yeah, it's kind of funny actually, because I know Whisper just dropped from, OpenAI. Everyone's been talking about that recently. Speaking of licensing for open source, you were mentioning before there's OpenRAIL. Is that a new license that you guys have worked on? Would you mind talking about that a bit?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so first of all, as a disclaimer, I'm not a legal expert, so there are people much more knowledgeable on this topic. But pretty much the idea is that since decades we have been doing licenses for software, and the idea is that we cannot really apply the same kind of licenses for machine learning models because the way they work is very different. So there is this idea of open and responsible AI licenses, and the idea is that they will allow for more open and responsible machine learning than what the current licenses related to code would allow. So in general, they allow for open access, but they have these specific responsible use cases which make them quite interesting. They are very, very recent, so there is not much legal history on this, but I think this is a quite interesting approach around machine learning and licensing.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And for those wondering, it's not necessarily OSI approved, but I think it's, I don't know. I would like to see some like subset that gets grouped for that, you know?
I actually have a question. I know you said, the disclaimer that you said that you're not like a pro in this, but still, I'm curious, do we already have a few types of these licenses?
Within OpenRAIL, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are different OpenRAIL licenses. There are at least 5 or 6. There is one that allows for commercial use cases. There are others that don't allow for commercial use cases. But then within the licenses, for example, what they try to do is that they try to discuss the potential, like the different use cases. So even if you allow for commercial use, you might disallow, for example, some of them might enforce people to disclaim in a product that they are interacting with a machine learning model, right? So these kind of things. There are a couple of different ones. So if you saw Stable Diffusion by Stability that was launched 2 months ago, that's a model that generates images. That's with an OpenRAIL license. There's another effort called Bloom, which is a huge model similar to GPT-3, but this is an open source, open science project, and here it also has a OpenRAIL license.
That's really interesting. Taking a step back real quick, you mentioned as well that there are different types of open source contributions that people make, different types of projects. Do we have like a couple that you guys think are like super high level, like top of mind?
Yeah, so from my side, I think this also starts getting quite nicely into what is a contribution to open source. So maybe we can like lead it into that as well.
Yeah.
But for example, I work at Deepset and we have Haystack, and I would argue that's an open source package. You can pip install it, you can use it. But other open source projects are maybe just a demo, maybe just a showcase. It can be a product, it could be a bit of research. Yeah, anything to add?
I think that's...
Yeah, I think...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Yeah, so along these software projects, there are also documentation, right? So most of the used libraries or programming languages, they come with documentation. Another kind of project would also be research. So many times when researchers publish a new algorithm, a new machine learning model, a new demo as well, so they go hand in hand. They might publish a repository with all of the artifacts, with a paper link, with a couple of different things. That's another kind of project as well that it can be open source.
Yeah, I think demos are really interesting because, like, I'll just speak from OpenSearch's perspective. We have such like a really wide set of projects that fall under, you know, the OpenSearch category. It's like you've got e-commerce, you've got document search, you've got observability and analytics. So like stepping into OpenSearch, you're going to be like instantly, I don't want to say overwhelmed, but like it's a lot. So seeing a demo like, oh, here's end to end what you can do with OpenSearch, you know, this is how you can kind of achieve this use case. I mean, I think it's really important to like inspire other new use cases that might come out of it. And Tuana, you kind of mentioned leading into what is a contribution. So you want to take a stab at what is a contribution? Like,
yeah. So I'd be curious to hear what you guys think of this. But so from my perspective, and having worked with Haystack so far, I think when people, so this live stream is titled "Contributing to Open Source," and I think when a lot of people approach that, the first thing that comes to mind is the open source product or package itself, like the source code itself. But in my honest opinion, being DevRel as well, that's only a small part of it. It's a very important part of it, but there's a lot more that goes into contributing to open source. So I think, one bit of it is code, and that can be anything from actually contributing a feature to a bug fix, to tests, etc. But it could also be non-code. So I would argue that writing an article or a blog about this project is a contribution to this open source project. Even reporting a bug and not fixing it, that is also a contribution. And then, maybe this is it could be code, depending on what type of showcase it is, but just showcasing it inside another project is also a contribution.
Oh, I did. Go ahead.
And very similar to bug request, also asking new features, right? So many times just opening an issue and suggesting, hey, this API would be nicer if it was like this instead. That's also a way to contribute to the open source ecosystem.
Yeah, Hall Director just called that out as well. Issues are contributions, and I think that is a good point. It's so hard working on open source because you don't have the visibility into your user base like some of these enterprise products do. You don't know unless people literally come in and tell you, I have a hard time with this, or this is, really great and we really love it, So that is huge. And tests too, I think, are another thing that's interesting. I've actually been working with a community called Casa OS, which is like this home, how to describe it? It's like this home hosting project, and one of the biggest things their code base needs right now is testing, because they're making these releases, they're developing very fast, but it's an open source project, so they've not put a ton of time into testing. So testing so that releases can be validated and come out in a consistent manner, I think, is super important.
Tuana also mentioned showcases, and just to dive a bit more into this, when maybe talking a bit more in the machine learning landscape for people that are into that, many times what happens is that research labs or companies or people share or train a very cool model, and they make it open source so anyone can access it. But the way in which people can use these models usually requires some technical expertise or some technical knowledge, and that means installing things in their machines or running a Google Colab or a Jupyter Notebook or whatnot, right? So this already puts a barrier of entry. That means that people that don't know anything about computer science or programming, they will struggle. So also creating interactive demos. So if you know Streamlit, for example, Gradio, these are two different open source libraries that allow people to build interactive demos for machine learning in Python. So these are very nice. And there are different solutions to deploy them. So there is Streamlit, there is Hugging Face Spaces, and a couple of other solutions. And that means that anyone can just go to these links and play out with these models. Usually these are also open source, so you have the models which are open source, you have the inference code which is open source, and you have the demo code which is also open source. And then these demos are out there in the cloud, so anyone with a browser can go and try it out, right? So if someone trains a model that does automatic speech recognition, and that is you speak into a microphone and it will give you the transcript of what you're saying, so similar to Whisper that you were mentioning before. Someone could, since the model is open source, anyone from the community can go and create a demo out of this. So what we saw 2 weeks ago, Whisper was released. 1 week ago, a community member created a demo that you put a link to a YouTube video and then you get the transcript of the video. And this was a link that anyone could go out and could play with this, and it got some tens of thousands of views in a week, right? So it's a way of just building everything open source, making machine learning more accessible to the whole community. And that also means that people from minority groups or underrepresented backgrounds could go and try them out, right? So if you have a demo that you only tried with white men, right? You might be missing a huge amount of the population that for which the model might not work correctly, for example. So that's something that is also very nice about open source.
Yeah. And actually, it's funny you mentioned that as well, because I am really wanting to get started with Haystack a little bit more, because I thought it would be really neat. Like, we have, these big projects by big companies. You've got Alexa, you've got, Google Home Assistant, all this stuff. And I think it would be really neat to, string together multiple of these. Like you could have Whisper, query Haystack, and then get an answer back in a like human readable friendly way. I mean, how cool would that be to be able to use your voice, query Haystack, and then have OpenSearch return the data? It's a full set that crosses 3 different levels or 3 different areas of expertise.
You're going to say we use the Hugging Face spaces a lot for this reason as well. And what you were talking about, Omar, made me think like, yeah, we briefly mentioned like documentation and showcases, etc. as well, but in a slightly meta way. Like you mentioned, like maybe it's not that the information isn't necessarily accessible for you to understand what's going on or be able to use it. So I'm just going to put out a very general term, a general sentence here, but any educational content that helps you understand what this bit of software is doing is, I would argue, is also a contribution to the mission thereafter, basically.
Yeah. And Stefano just mentioned that he thinks Hugging Face spaces are phenomenal. So that is one of the areas that I want to work on for us at OpenSearch, is having good education and in the right places. So if anyone wants to contribute, please feel free. Speaking of, let's talk about this. Like, who can contribute? What are there any requirements we feel like to contribute, or
Pretty much, if you have a computer or a phone, you can contribute. And we can talk a bit more about how you can contribute a bit later on, but pretty much you just create an account in any of these open source platforms. So that could be GitHub, that could be Hugging Face, that could be GitLab, and you can just contribute. Even if you don't have a computer science background, or even if you have not done any professional or any programming at all in your life, even doing translations are a way to contribute to open source. So I don't think there should be any restriction on who could contribute.
I would also add here that there are lots of people who use contributing to open source as an educational tool for themselves. So it's a starting step for them to start learning how a certain tool works, or even how a contribution works, really. So I would, agree with Omar and say it's literally open to anyone.
Yeah. I would say probably you should at least have tried the project first. Or if you can't get started, actually, that's another really good point, is being able to get started is vital to being able to contribute, and can be a contribution point as well. Because if you can't get started, you don't have those demos, for some reason the showcase isn't working for you, airing that out, you might find that a lot of other people are having the same issue. And that's a really great contribution to add. And also one key point, make sure as well that your organization is okay with you doing it if you're doing it on work time. Some organizations have restrictions, so just the same, we're not legal experts. Make sure your company is okay with you contributing. But if they are, please do, and use your company time. I work full-time on open source. Actually, all 3 of us work full-time on open source, which I think is just phenomenal. And there are opportunities out there for that. So let's talk a little bit about how to contribute. So we've talked about what contributions are. We've talked about who can contribute. How do you get started with contributing?
Again, I'm going to start off with giving examples on the Haystack repo, and then I think someone was trying to unmute themselves. Sorry, I just kind of see people muted, so I butt in. But Omar, I'll hand it over to you in a bit because I think it was you. So we wrote down some examples of what might be good ways to start contributions if it's your first time. And I also have a few examples of what you could do if it's not your first time and you want to contribute maybe something significantly larger. But there are a lot of GitHub repositories. You can filter down to tags. So you can have a look at the issues in a certain GitHub repository, and you can have a look for good first issues. So these are what the maintainers and people who work on the project will tag certain issues as a good first issue, and this you can sort of be confident that it's easy enough for you to start off with and build your confidence with to start contributing more. So that's definitely a good one. And then I'll hand over to you, Omar, and then I'll give another example from Haystack later as well.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think filtering by tags is always a good way. There are usually like these first good issues or contributions welcomed, and a couple of other tags that are very common to find where you could help. Of course, if you have a bit more knowledge and you spot a bug in this product or this library, so if you're a user of an open source tool or product or whatever, and you find a bug or you would like some additional feature, you can always open yourself a feature request as an issue or a bug report, and then you can start. Of course, if the owners give a green light, you can start contributing to that as well. Yeah, and usually when you start to work in an open source project, there are usually some guidelines that you will see across most of open source. So these are rules of thumb that you will not find in 100% of the repositories, but at least something that is extremely common in any relatively large open source library is a contributing empty file. So that's a markdown file that explains how you can contribute, how to do the initial setup in your computer. So for example, at Hugging Face, we have a couple of open source libraries. One of them is called Transformers. And here, if you want to start contributing directly to the library, you need to do a clone of the repository, you need to set up the upstream, you need to install some dependencies, so you need to do all of that setup. So usually, the first thing that you should do once you decide that you would like to contribute and you have a green light is reading this contributing file and seeing how you can, how you need to set up everything. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think the other thing is, it can be so hard to just get started. And I think that's just like a little bit of advice I've heard said by a lot of open source contributors who do this a lot, is even just something simple like, whether it's just a small doc fix, getting something out is kind of the key. And then you can feel your way through the process, and more often than not, the maintainers are there, other contributors are there, and they'll help you kind of find the processes, find the, these are the guidelines, or you need to be looking in this docs folder or something like that. I'm actually going to drop a link in here because one of the tags that we're using very heavily right now is our Hacktoberfest tag. Hacktoberfest, for those who don't know, is just kind of like this month-long celebration of open source, really designed to help people get started, just get going with your first contributions. And they have a really good guide that I'll put in the chat. There we go.
You were mentioning the role of the owners, like how that they will give you pointers, and I think this is something quite interesting. So usually when you start to contribute, you will be very lost and you will not know exactly where to contribute. So usually in the GitHub issues, what usually happens is that they become a bit of a discussion place in which you can discuss the design of what you're adding, right? So if you're adding a new function, the first instinct should not be run and write code and open a PR, a pull request. Instead, usually you will discuss with the owners and see what would make the most sense. And this is a bit of an investment at the beginning, but what will happen is that once you actually open a pull request and send them some code, the library owners will be much happier and will merge your code much faster than if you just ran and created the code. I think that's something interesting. And Tuana was mentioning before that contributing to open source is also a very nice way to learn, right? It's a bit of an education process. So that's also a very nice way of informally getting mentored by people that have open source experience or professional software engineering experience.
I actually wanted to add something to this as well, because you mentioned this like discussion about how to best implement something if you're a new starter, and have a discussion with the owners about that and then go ahead with that. Something that we've started doing with Haystack, and this is sort of going a bit to the side where the person might be a lot more used to doing contributions, and I know a lot of open source projects also do this regularly, is let's say we're lucky still that at Haystack we can still accept these big feature contributions, but let's say you want to contribute something that's quite large, which requires quite a bit of work, and you might have your own ideas, but the project maintainers and the owners might have other ideas of how best to implement that. This is where some open source projects, and now Haystack as well, would ask you to create an RFC, which is like it's a request for comments. So it's just a document detailing how you would like to implement a certain feature. And then you can have this discussion back and forth with the other contributors of the project and the maintainers of the project, where everyone comes to a consensus of how to implement it. And even, I would say, submitting that RFC and starting that conversation is a massive contribution to that open source project anyway. And it tends to be the type of thing that once everyone's agreed to the RFC, it may also mean that there are multiple contributions that make up that RFC. But yeah, what you said made me think about that, Omar, about the back and forth to decide on the best practice of how to actually implement something.
So it's interesting you mentioned consensus, and actually that is something we're working on as well. There's this other idea that was put out there by Apache. I'm going to drop a link to it in the chat, about lazy consensus as well, which I think we all work at fairly, large companies that have very active contributors, and we can be very interactive with them. But for smaller communities, sometimes there's not always that, back and forth that happens. You might put something out there and no one responds. And that's actually okay, because normally if people have an issue with something, they're going to tell you very carefully why that issue is, not possible, or that feature can't be implemented. So the idea of lazy consensus is basically, if no one's saying no, go ahead and implement it. Start working. And, to Omar's point, once you have code in, you have your issue. You said, look, I created this here. This is where I talked about it. No one had any objections. Here's what that looks like. And a lot of times that's where you'll see some more feedback coming, like, hey, what if we tried it a little bit more like this? So getting that code out there is a form of lazy consensus. I'm going to take a pause real quick because we had a really great question in the chat as well. What technologies or software do you feel like goes hand in hand with contributing to open source?
Git. If you do want to contribute to the source code itself, I think that's definitely a skill that's worth having. Yeah.
Like version control systems like GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. There are some really obscure ones out there.
Oh yeah, that's what they were waiting for, apparently.
Yeah. All right, so we've talked a little bit about all right, so let's get something on an issue. What other ways do you guys feel like there are to communicate with the community? I mean, I feel like there are a lot of channels sometimes. What other channels have you guys seen for communication?
Do you want to take it, Omar? I feel like I'm butting in too much, so I'm gonna wait for it.
Yeah, for sure. I can go first here. By the way, I might have a bit of a delay, but hopefully the audio is good. But yeah, so I think it depends a lot. So some communities just rely completely in GitHub. GitHub has something called GitHub discussion, so sometimes people discuss over there. But then people like to discuss in many chat applications. Discord is probably the most popular one since a year ago or so. but previously many communities were using Slack, and because of that, many communities are still using Slack. Many companies or many libraries also have forums. So if you have used Fast.ai, if you have used Streamlit, Hugging Face, and many other open source projects, they most likely have some kind of forum in which you can interact. And then there's even social media. Hugging Face, for example, uses Twitter and LinkedIn quite a bit, and we actually we have implemented features that have been requested through Twitter sometimes. So it's not the most efficient way to ask for new things, but we do hear and we do interact with the community on Twitter as well. And those are just some ideas that I have right now, but I'm sure that there are a bunch of other places. I know that I think there's some kind of GitHub-based chat application, which I don't recall the name right now, but some communities also use that, and I'm sure there are many others.
This is something that I'm not aware of, but I'll be very interested in what it is. I guess this can be considered, maybe we can consider it a forum, but I would say, I mean, I'm not saying we use it a lot, but I've noticed some open source communities are very active on Reddit as well, for example. Yeah.
No, I think that's a good call out. And I think, each of these places has their own place in an open source project. It's kind of hard because there are so many different peoples with different type of needs. A lot of people I know like to rely heavily on the forum. I personally like Discord style chat. A lot of people in my organization like Slack. So we've gone back and forth a lot about, do we open a Slack or do we open a Discord? And I think that's one of those things where, again, community, like your voice matters so much, hearing from the community on where they like to communicate is really important. Email, that's another one.
Email.
Yeah, the Telegram for sure as well.
Yeah, Telegram.
I think one experience we had, so at Hugging Face, every couple of months we organize some community events, which are open and are free. And last year, around July, we did an event with Google in which we gave free TPUs for people to train very large models on whatever they wanted. And there were some interesting things there. And we organized this event in Slack. So we invited people to Slack, and pretty much what happened is that people were not liking Slack anymore. And pretty much what happened is that they decided to create a Discord on their own. And they created a bunch of channels over there, and they were extremely active over there. There were 500 people maybe, or 400 people at least. So it was a huge amount of people in an extremely active Discord for 3-4 weeks that that event lasted. And this was a very clear signal for us that the community doesn't want to use a big, not all the community, but a huge proportion of the community wants to use Discord now. So that's something that was interesting. But then we do see a bit of a age gap sometimes. So usually people that have more experience in the industry or in research labs prefer to stay in Slack, but people that are new or students, they usually love Discord. So there's also a bit of different mixed opinions on this.
Can add some things from my recent experience. So we recently did the controversial move for our community from Slack to Discord, and I think there's a few things that you consider. You consider what your community, what the people in your community that are there now want, but it's also to do with the maintainers of that open source project and the people behind it, and what kind of interaction they want to have with what kind of community they want to build. There are subtle differences in each tool, and depending on what kind of space you want to share with them, that goes into, I think, one of the choices of whether you go with Discord and Slack. In a lot of ways, they're very similar, but in a lot of subtle ways, they're quite different. And I think, it's also depends on what type of interaction you want to have with your community.
That's a very good point, because from the perspective of a maintainer, you already need to keep up to date in GitHub, right? where you already have a bunch of notifications. You have to review PRs, you have to answer issues, you have your own coding to do, you have all of the discussions internally in your company. In my case, that's in Slack. And then you add social media if you use Twitter or LinkedIn that we were mentioning before. So there you already have 4 different places to interact with the community. So now if you add Discord or more places and the forum, right? So now we have 6 places. That as a maintainer can be overwhelming as well. So it's also totally fair as a maintainer to say, I don't want to split up the discussions between forum, GitHub, and Discord. I just want to keep things fully focused in GitHub, and that's something that is something totally fair, and that's something that as a maintainer you can decide that kind of thing. Of course, what happens sometimes with the communities is that especially if they are big, they will just do whatever they want to do when they are at certain scale. So if at some point, as we were talking before, they decide to go to Discord, that might happen, but you can decide how you interact with your own community, for sure.
Yeah. So for anyone wanting to contribute or be a part of that community, I would say try to seek out where they're most active, because it might be the case that you're posting a message somewhere, but it actually turns out that they're really focusing on GitHub. It might be more useful for you to go put a discussion point up there.
Yeah, actually, and to that point, I think it's really interesting talking about the difference between Slack and Discord. And in my perspective, Discord is one of those places where the community kind of rules the way, so to speak. They lead the conversations. The interesting thing is it turns out that a lot of those communities become like self-servicing. So talking about I'm in a Discord for Zima board, which is a single board computer, and it's become very interesting how the experts on the product are no longer the people on the product team. The entire community has taken up, and any question that gets asked in the Discord is answered by a community member. If they don't know, or if no one seems to know, then they'll ping one of the maintainers. But it's become its own, self-maintaining system, whereas I feel like Slack, more often than not, it's for people who want to be able to keep up with the conversation. Everything is nice and organized. You have a top-level comment and it starts a thread, and then if you want to, you can dive into that, versus Discord, which is frankly a little bit chaotic at times. Fun and phenomenal, because you no longer have to be the only person answering, which I think is why I personally prefer Discord. And talking about kind of pinging the maintainers, that's a really good point for when you're working in, on a project, or maybe you've put in a PR. Not all maintainers are, keeping eyes on it all the time. So if you're not getting traction, if you feel like your PR has gone left unnoticed, feel free to go into the maintainer's MD file, see who's maintaining it, and give them a ping. Wait a little bit, be patient, because everyone's really busy. It feels like, like Omar mentioned, there's a lot of different channels that maintainers get added on. I can just say from personal experience, OpenSearch has some 70 repos, and I have 800 emails a week that get dropped in my inbox, and I don't go through them all. If I'm being transparent, I just don't have time. But at the same time, so just work on getting their attention and find out where they are, to Tuana's point.
I think before going directly and sending them a DM in Twitter or LinkedIn or whatnot, what I would suggest to do is you open your PR, and if it's not urgent, just be patient, wait a week, maybe 2 weeks. People take holidays, right? So don't get stressed if your PR doesn't get reviewed right away. And if then 10 days go by and there are no replies, just directly in the same PR, you can just say friendly ping I don't know, something like that. So there's no need to also go to other platforms. Then of course, if still 2 months go by, maybe then it makes a bit more sense. But I think that generally I would try to keep things scope within GitHub or wherever the contribution is happening. But I think that's a good point.
To that point, yeah. Sorry, I should have clarified. That is what I meant. If you ping me directly,
Okay.
I will actually redirect you back to GitHub and say let's talk about it in public. And actually, that's a really good point. I've gotten, like Omar mentioned, I've had people reaching out to me on LinkedIn, Twitter, and stuff like that. And I used to have conversations with people there, but I realized very quickly that conversation is now. I've transferred a whole lot of knowledge onto this person, and they are the only other person in the world who benefits from that. So having these conversations in the open is extremely important.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, I
another
agree
thing
with that
that
a lot. Sorry, I was just agreeing with David on that because yeah, if you have a conversation about a specific contribution internally, great, and the contribution goes well. But then let's say 5 months down the line, there's a new feature coming along, and people need to know the history of why something happened the way it did. It's great to have that documented inside the project as well. Yeah.
I think that's also something that we discussed a lot internally when we decided to create a Discord, because when people use a forum, those like that knowledge is easily searchable and easily shared for the future. And discussions in Discord, now it's a bit better, but usually they get lost after some time. So you kind of lose that knowledge, and in the forum or in GitHub, you keep that knowledge. Something that I was thinking about when you were talking about pinging the maintainers was this process of cycles, in some sense, in which you open a PR, the maintainer gives you feedback, then you iterate on that, and there's this thing in which usually both the maintainer and you, the goal of both parties is to get this merge as soon as possible, right? So you want your contribution to be in, but at the same time, of course, the quality needs to adhere to the standards that the maintainers expect. So there are a couple of things that you can do to make it easier, so to reduce the number of loops or cycles that you need to have, right? And that's something that we discussed a bit before, but maybe we didn't discuss too much in detail. So I don't know if it's okay if I dive a bit into that.
Yeah.
Cool, yeah. So before we were mentioning that there's usually a contributing MD file that explains how to do the setup and how to do all these kind of things. Something that usually happens as well is that what you will want to do is to, once you do the code, usually there are some code style guidelines, and there are usually automatic tools that will check this style for you, or will even like reformat the Python code for you, for example. And there are commands for this, so that's something that usually many people miss, and because of that, usually PRs can get merged a couple of days later just because they forgot to do this style check, for example. So that's one example of something simple that could make things much faster to merge. Yeah, and I think that's just one example, but I'm sure there are a couple of other things that you can do. So, for example, a good PR title is already helpful. If you are contributing with some more complex Python code, creating a Jupyter notebook or a code lab that showcases how it would work. Or that could be, of course, ideally in some documentation that you add in the same PR, so it depends a bit on each repo. But already having some self-contained example on how this will work, that's something that is also extremely useful, because as a maintainer, that already gives me a high-level view of how this is supposed to work, what you had in mind when you added this feature, and then being able to put myself in your shoes, I would be able to get this reviewed in a much easier way.
Yeah. Actually, I want to add one thing there, because I have a huge example that we come across almost daily, I feel like, in the OpenSearch group, which is the Developer Certificate of Origin. It's called the DCO, and it's a common way to just like add a little signature that says, I'm the one who wrote this code and I am giving it to the community. And that is one step that I feel like is missed so incredibly frequently, and we spend cycles on this. So going through and making sure you're following the contributing MD, you'll see very quickly you just need git commit dash lowercase s, and that's it. And it's but that is one of those things that could really help smooth the process and make sure we're not just like going back and forth for 3-4 days, weeks, months. I mean, we've had a couple that have been open for a seriously long time for just that reason.
There's a question from Stefano in the chat here, which is a really nice one. By the way, Stefano is a good example of someone who is is it weird to call it a multilingual contributor? So not just code, but various other things in the way you're contributing. I don't know. I kind of like that, multilingual contributor. And when we're talking about Discord, actually, he was one of the first ones that I thought about, because Omar, you mentioned that, I think it was David, that when you go to Discord, like the community start helping each other out, it becomes a self-moving engine. And Stefano's a good example of one of those people who will jump in and answer people's questions on the Haystack Discord. And he's asking now, can you try to express your vision about the role of communities for companies which deliver open source software? So what's the role of the community as a collective, is what I'm understanding, for companies that deliver open source software. And to be honest with you, I think from an open source, a Haystack perspective, the community is literally the engine that keeps it going and growing and getting better, because it's the community that we constantly get improvements from, advice on improvements from. And it's also, there's another facet to it, is also for open source projects. I think the community is the thing that spreads the word about this tool and drives adoption. So it's very deep, and it's very much in the essence of how this open source project becomes a success or not a success, I would say.
Yeah, I think as a company, it depends a bit on what kind of company you are. I think it's, as we were talking before, there are many things that can be open source. So, for example, there are large companies that contribute to open source, but open source is not necessarily at the core of the company, right? So, all large companies, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all of them, Facebook, all of them contribute to open source, which is greatly appreciated. You have PyTorch, you have TensorFlow, you have a bunch of libraries that move the field forward, but they are not open source first companies, which is something totally fine. But then there are other companies, that's the case of Haystack, of course, and that's the case of Hugging Face as well, in which they are open source first companies, and they are community driven in some sense. And when I was talking before, I was mentioning that we always hear to the community everywhere, and that means that every time we prioritize what we want to add to our open source libraries, that's fully based on what the community asks us, right? So the community wanted more models for computer vision. We decided to add more models for computer vision. The community wanted better documentation. We hired a technical writer to fully work in the documentation, right? And just as an example, Hugging Face has a bunch of different open source libraries, like very, very well maintained libraries. One of them, the most famous one, is Transformers. It has 70K stars in GitHub. And if you look at the contributors, and let me check it right now, we have almost 1,500 contributors, right? That means that literally 1.5 thousand people went to this library and have contributed. It could have been a typo, it could have been a bug, but it could have also been, and many people have done this, they added new model architectures, they ported PyTorch code to TensorFlow, they added better documentation. And literally, for Hugging Face as a company, we define ourselves as a community because everything we do is community driven. So yeah, I think it's very similar to what Tuana said. For us, Hugging Face without community wouldn't be Hugging Face, just a face, I guess.
Yeah. It's probably the same for OpenSearch. I think OpenSearch is becoming one of the larger open source projects at Amazon. And I think it's interesting because we're taking it from the perspective that it's not necessarily Amazon's project, if that makes sense. It is the community-driven OpenSearch project. And putting it in that kind of mindset, we're making every effort and taking every opportunity to make sure we're good stewards in the community ourselves. We're a partner of the community, not necessarily the community, So I think that's really interesting. And, like everyone said, without the community, you're just kind of shouting into the open, you know. You need your community to understand that feedback, to know where to go next, to understand what people are looking for. And it's interesting because, you know, our community, we have several different niches, which means we also almost have several different communities that fall under the OpenSearch umbrella. You know, we have the observability and open telemetry community, and they have a specific set of needs. And we have the search, you know, kind of core search and almost more academic type community that uses it. Without being tapped into where those people are talking and what they're saying, we wouldn't have any clue. I think a great example of this recently was we had a guy come into one of our community meetings, and he said, hey, look, you guys have KNN and it's based off of Lucene. Like, why doesn't it have pre-filtering? Like, that's a native part of KNN for Lucene. And we were like, oh, well, yeah, I guess that's important. And several other people chimed up, you know, like, hey, yeah, this would be phenomenal. And several months later, we rolled out pre-filtering for KNN. We might have prioritized something else if we hadn't had that conversation with that community member. So I think community is kind of the core for open source software. If you're not in your community, paying attention to your community, maybe you're not so open about your source, you know? So that's a thought. And we have one last thing we wanted to talk about before we open up for just general Q&A. So where can we find projects looking for contributions? Like, where do you guys go to say, like, hey, like, I should contribute to this project?
I think the best first place should be an open source project that you're using. So for example, if you are an ML engineer and you love to use scikit-learn, why don't you look at the scikit-learn repository and search for good first issues? I think if you want to contribute, you should really be motivated to spend your time and contributing and contribute to it. So I think the best place would be contributing to something that you use in your day-to-day.
Yeah, pay attention to what you're pip installing. Have a look at where the source code is. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also, you know, there are so many different mechanisms you can use to find where they need help. And most importantly, though, like you mentioned, it's what you're using. Like, for example, I was using a FastAI library at one point. I think they had, what was it? It's either a Twitter or some other like scraping utility. And I was like, oh, this method is broken. So create a PR or create a bug, create a PR, and that's a really great way to get started. Otherwise, you know, there's good first issue tags. Hacktoberfest has a whole list of different repositories, you know, so you could try something new.
Ooh, one thing I would add here.
Yeah.
If you are going the route that Omar and I were mentioning, pay attention to what you're installing, maybe something that you're using a lot, have a look at the GitHub. Also pay attention to how well that project is actually maintained. There might be packages that you're using extensively that have sort of died and not people aren't really maintaining it anymore. So it's a good idea to have a look at, you know, when was the last PR merge, when was the last commit, when was the last issue, etc., so that your efforts are not gone to waste.
That is so true. So I'm going to throw a personal example there. There is this library, Kagami Go Face, which does facial detection, and it's really neat. And I got really involved with it, started playing around with it a lot. And I noticed after some time of, you know, writing and tweaking and making some changes and recommendations, I was like, oh, the last merged PR was in 2020. It had been almost a year and a half since a single PR was merged. So it hurts, you know, but at the same time, it is really good to, you know, pay attention to that.
I think so. Before you mentioned Hacktoberfest, and I guess if you're a bit lost and you don't know where to start contributing, Hacktoberfest is one kind of event where you can contribute, but there are a couple of others. So Hacktoberfest is very nice. It's in October. You get some swag at the end, or you can donate that, and they will plant a tree for you instead. So that's very nice. So that's one way where you can contribute. And there, I think the requirement is to open 4 PRs that are merged in a Hacktoberfest maintained project. And Hacktoberfest is just a tag that any repository can really add. So you can find thousands of these projects out there. That's in one side. I would say in the complete opposite side, there is a Google Summer of Code. So this is a very neat program that previously was just for students, but now, if I recall correctly, it is for everyone. And here you work for 3 to 6 months, depending on what kind of project you pick, in an open source project, and Google will pay you. So this is not an open source project of Google, although there is TensorFlow. These are 20 to 50, if I recall correctly, open source projects. Here you can find all kinds of things. And you can contribute to these projects with a mentor from one or two mentors from this company that will guide you through the whole process. And at the same time, Google will pay you a bit. So it's not that you are a Google employee or an employee of this open source company or a company with an open source project, but that's also a very nice way to get some work in a summer, for example. If you're a student, that's something that could be exciting. And previously I mentioned these Hugging Face events that we organize. So every 2-3 months we organize these sprints. This is more geared towards people that want to contribute to open source machine learning, but if you want to contribute to train a model, in these events we give free GPUs that you probably don't have the money to pay, and you can do some interesting fun experiments. And there are a couple of other ML communities that are open source. So there is Eleuter.ai, for example, that you can also check out.
I'll plug Haystack here too, because Haystack's always open for contributions. And you can use the tags we mentioned, like the good first issue or contributions wanted. There's always something there.
Yeah, for sure. Same with OpenSearch. Also, apologies to everyone. I just realized that the links that I've been dropping in chat are getting auto-modded by YouTube. So hang around. We will post a blog after the fact, and that'll have a lot of the details that we've shared here. So thank you so much. Do you guys have any thoughts on bug bounties? Nate asked that in the chat.
This is an interesting one. I haven't really thought about this at all, but just from a maintainer's perspective, I guess I can imagine that it's one of those things where I think an open source project and the maintainers would have to be sure that they're ready for bug bounties.
Yeah.
And ready to deal with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it is. Oh, go ahead, Omar. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that I've never experimented with them. I've never seen them. So I know that a couple of projects do them, but I would need to read a bit more to give a proper answer on this.
Yeah. I think the one thing that becomes challenging with implementing like a bug bounty program is you have to validate that the bug was actually fixed, and that can be a real challenge. And a lot of times the people that are doing these are only motivated by the money, which can be a good thing, because if you need a bug fixed and you don't have time to dig in, that can be helpful. But it can be challenging to keep up with, I guess, and the contributions could be all over the place, and it happens all over with Hacktoberfest. Anytime there's an incentive, people will try and take advantage of it. But I think overall, at least from my experience with Hacktoberfest, the good outweighs the bad. You get a lot of good contributions, and a lot of people get introduced to your community that might not have otherwise.
Get the link I sent, by the way. Maybe I can send the links you meant to send, David, if you did.
I'm not sure they're coming through in chat. I think
Okay.
YouTube might be auto deleting them because it's like a spam prevention thing. But regardless, we'll put them through at the in an article covering some of this.
There was one last topic that we didn't have time to cover, unfortunately, but just something to bring up is the topic of diversity in open source. And the last time I read the stats, by far most of the contributors in open source are men, and usually people in privileged positions. So at least for companies that just hire people that have done open source work, they need to be extremely careful, because if they do that, they will be already hiring just from a very non-diverse pool compared to what is in industry. So it's even less diverse than what you will see in industry. So I think that's a very quick disclaimer that I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important to highlight. And there are communities out there as well. So if, for example, if you're a woman or you're of certain ethnicity, there are communities out there to help you get started, and I would strongly recommend them. The foundations that I've seen so far have been phenomenal contributions. So yeah.
Yeah, there is Pilates, for example, on this, and there are many others. I think it's probably a very good topic for another podcast, because I think diversity and open source is a huge topic to just discuss for 2 minutes. But
Yeah. I will say though, I've noticed that there's at least we're getting more female representation from from within the communities of, let's say, the maintainers of open source. I would say I'm seeing more and more female developer advocates like myself. Who are there to sort of help out the community as well. So hopefully it'll get better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Tuana, Omar, for coming, answering all these wonderful questions. Oh God, see, all right. Maybe I need to pay for Discord so that I can have fun emojis, because I've got like rocket. You guys are too cool. Anyhow, thank you everyone for your time, and we'll catch you in our next live stream. Take care.
yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye-bye.